All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are. I'm going to talk to you about something called the Articles of Confederation. Articles of Confederation. Basically, what this is the first document that outlined how the U.S. government was going to run. And so basically, it says, the government can do this, they can't do that. And remember, the government we're talking about are things like Congress and the president and all of those kinds of things. So a couple of things about the Articles of Confederation you got to know. There were a couple good things that happened, and then there were a few things that kind of held it back from being effective. And those are some of the things that we want to talk about. A couple of things that happened that were good. Under the Articles of Confederation, they kind of had to decide what was going to happen to all the land that they got from the Treaty of Paris. Okay, and under the Treaty of Paris, remember that the United States got all the land east of the Mississippi. And the lands that weren't settled just yet were places like the Ohio River Valley and areas like Michigan and Indiana and Wisconsin. And you'll see that on some of the maps that you look at about these areas. So what they did is they started surveying the land. And the thing that they passed was called the Land Ordinance of 1785. And what this did was it divided the land into what we call townships, and this made it easier for people to settle these areas. If they were divided into what we call townships, they provided schools and things like that. The second thing that they passed was called the NORTHWEST Ordinance. Now, this is a very, very interesting piece of legislation that was passed, or a law that was passed. And basically what it said was it gave the groundwork or the framework for how a state becomes a state. And they had to decide. They're like, okay, are we going to just have American colonies the same way that the British had colonies? Or are we going to be able to just add states to the United States of America? And they said, you know what? I think it's best if we just add states. So what they had to do was they had to decide, okay, at what point do we call these areas states? And what we've got and what we need to understand about that is that the first part of it was that once they had 5,000 men living in these areas, they could set up their own kind of local governments in those areas. So say 5,000 men move to an area which today is known as Ohio, or today an area that's known as Michigan. What they do is once they have 5,000 people, they can then have their own government. Okay, so it's like a local government. All right? Once they have 60,000 people living in these areas, now I'm talking about men, women, and children, that's when they can apply to become a state. So the Northwest Ordinance gives the groundwork for how these areas become states and then are added to the United States of America. So it took some time for people to settle these areas, but over time, this stood in place for expansion of the United States of America. Now, those are two good things about the Articles of Confederation. Let's get into some of the things that really needed to be fixed. A couple of things that the government could do under the Articles of Confederation. They could set up a postal service. They could declare war or peace. But they could print money. So those are some all right things, but one of the big things that held them back, and this has ramifications for a lot of stuff, is they couldn't collect taxes. Now, if the government can't collect taxes, they really can't do anything that costs money. So they had some issues with this, and some reasons why they had issues is because they had no money to pay for anything. Okay, which means, yeah, you can raise an army, but how are you going to pay for the army? And they had a lot of these issues that held back a lot of the power that the government could have. Okay? And remember, we're talking about a government that would then pass laws and tax the entire country, not just state by state. And that was one of the big issues, is that they left the taxation up to the states. So what ends up happening because of this lack of ability to tax people, we see rebellions all over the country, okay? Rebellions have to do with people not being able to pay these taxes on their farms. They weren't making enough money, or the taxes were unfair, and they were essentially having their farms taken away from them. The most famous rebellion that took place was known as Shay's Rebellion, and this guy named Daniel Shay was a former soldier. He was a Revolutionary War veteran, and he gets these unfair taxes, and they're threatening to take his farm away. So what he does is he essentially says, you know what? I want to see you try to take my farm away. That's great. Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get my buddies who are in the same situation. We're going to go down to the courthouse, and we're going to essentially say, you have no authority over us, courthouse. You can't enforce these laws. And they basically were like, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? And what we see happening is this happening all over the country now. But Shay's Rebellion is really bad because these guys went to the armory, the place where they store all the guns in their town, and basically took it over and said, guess what? We run the town now. And the problem with the Articles of Confederation is that the government couldn't do anything about it. They didn't have money for an army to be able to enforce the laws of the land. So they're like, sorry, we can't do anything about this. But you know, Shay's Rebellion, maybe we should think about revamping the Articles of Confederation and try fixing the Articles of Confederation so that this kind of thing doesn't happen all over the country. So Shay's Rebellion was one of the biggest reasons why all the states sent delegates or representatives to Philadelphia to fix the Articles of Confederation. And what ends up happening? They create the Constitution. Okay? So I want you to know a few things about the Articles of Confederation. It has to do with the problems that arose because of the lack of power that the Articles of Confederation had. Look at your book, ask questions, make sure you got an understanding of why it was that the Constitutional Convention took place. See you later. I'm at a red light. Whoop, whoop.